Welcome back to Minnesota's Let's Talk, a podcast that brings you valuable resources for prospective and current adoptive and foster families, as well as professionals. My name is Chris, and I'm an education coordinator at Minnesota.
And I'm Bridget, education director at FAM.
Bridget, we have Charley Joyce and Rick Delaney back to talk about the exhaustion of parenting a child with bottomless needs.
This is so exciting. It's hard to believe that this is our fourth episode with them. We are going to have a great conversation around this topic, along with case examples. Really looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, and I feel at this point we don't need a long introduction since I know our listeners have listened to every episode. Wink. So to keep it fresh, I'll keep things brief. Charley Joyce and Dr. Rick Delaney have known each other for years. They're a training powered duo. Both have presented to hundreds, probably thousands, child welfare staff, mental health professionals, foster kinship, and adoptive parents. Although they are both retired, they continue to share their knowledge and years of expertise working in this field. I think one of the titles they're most proud of is grandfather. Welcome, Charley and Rick. Great to have you back. Let's talk. Rick or Charley, could you explain what you mean by the exhaustion of parenting a child with bottomless needs?
Sure, I can start with that, Chris. What we mean by that is often youth that are served in foster care can display kind of a constant need for reassurance, and that can be a physical need or it can be a verbal need. It can also represent themselves by having challenges in physically separating from a foster parent, or the child that constantly asks the same question over and over again, such as, is this okay? Am I doing this okay? Should I do this? Is this okay? And the child that's an interpreter, that you really can't finish what you're trying to say to the child because they jump in with some question or interpretation that's interruptive. And it can also represent itself through the child that won't parent share, meaning that if there's attention that the parent shows to other children, that in some way presents a threat to the child that is needy in staying connected to the parent, and so they'll interrupt that process. And sometimes this can be singular neediness that shows itself, such as in routine expectations for kids, such as attending school, adhering to a bedtime or actually going to bed, and playing without parental involvement. And the neediness that I've experienced in how foster youth will show this can be kind of two extremes. It can be in a helpless manner, kind of crying and what we often refer to as whining, or it can come to a point where it really is kind of a panic defiance, that the child becomes so scared that they demand and they lose control over themselves in demanding that the parents stay connected with them. And I don't know, Rick, if that matches up with your experience also on this topic.
Oh, that's spot on, Charley. Yes, it does. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but this kind of incessant neediness is explainable and definitely comes from a child's history oftentimes. And it impacts parents. So parents listening in today, I imagine, would resonate to this story. A foster father out in rural Montana said he was walking to his rural mailbox and down the driveway, the long driveway, and he looked around and he said to himself, who are all these children and why are they following me? You know, he was like Conrad Lorenz with those little ducks following behind him. I talked to another foster mother who said, I ran into her in town one time at a grocery store. She said, I hit him with the handle of the hoe in the head. I said, what? She said, I know it sounds bad, but it's springtime. I'm doing my gardening. I have two shadows, my own shadow and my second shadow, who is Jimmy. That's not his real name. She turned with the hoe and the handle. He was so close behind her, conked him right in the head. So it's this type of shadowing behavior, that incessant demand, I think you're getting to, Charley. And I was just going to say that what sets the stage for this, you'll talk about this, I think, in more detail, but sometimes it starts very early with infants, and from birth, infants are sending out a serve. It's almost like a tennis game. They serve, and the parent or the caregiver returns, and it's baby cries, gurgles, smiles, has gas, whatever. We coo, we minister, we diaper, we do whatever we do. We close the gap and space between us. Humans are social animals with brains hardwired to connect. So we all have this urge to merge as social animals. The serve and return reciprocity that's going on there builds architecture in the child's brain. The connections inside the brain are connecting like the connections in the social world outside. Without that, though, then we have a child who feels like they're playing one-handed, one-person tennis. They're serving and nothing's coming back. The good parenting that we're hoping for all children is that parents, caregivers listen to and respond. They see, they respond, they hear, they feel, and they listen with a third ear. And sometimes they can even hear what hasn't yet been uttered, what hasn't yet been served. But I just wanted to just sort of say that, Charlie, that there's definitely reasons, and I think maybe you'd have some thoughts about some of the reasons for kids getting so needy in the first place.
I think you explained that really well, Rick. And if I remember some of the study that I did on attachment, one of the texts I remember referred to it as the guarantee for safety through connectedness with a parent.
Right.
Such as that a child that's born when they're in infancy, they signal to the parent that they're hungry, that they're hot, that they're cold, that they're wet, that they need a parental attention, and that signal, the parent then responds. And it's not only that they guarantee their safety, but as I think you mentioned and mentioned well, is it starts the process of being able to depend on a caregiver to respond to needs. And I think that's one of the things that's inherent in this topic is the absence of response to needs. So I definitely agree with how you described that process.
So I think it's so helpful that you guys are explaining this in terms of the attachment and the early stages as little babies, just going, am I here? Am I here? And then I'm plugging in a picture of a 12-year-old almost doing the same thing. Do you see me? Am I here? Do I exist? I can only exist if you notice that I exist, and so I recognize that for those kids. And I think that explanation is so helpful, just to understand what they're kind of going for here, whether their neediness is, do you see me? Do you see me,
Yes.
close versus, do you see me? Do you see me hitting this thing or punching my brother or breaking your vase, but if we could talk now a little bit about how that impacts the foster parents, we kind of can understand where these kids are coming from. But then what are the effects on the foster parents as they deal with this?
Absolutely.
Well, and I think that was a real nice way of saying it, that, we see the beginning, the start to the problem of not getting the response to the signal that Charlie's talking, not getting a response to, do you see me? Do you see me? Which is a game really played when children are about 18 months to 3 years, when they're at a distance from you. They run off, they're drunk with mobility, and they toddle down the street, not looking behind them. But then they fall, and they suddenly notice, first thing they do is they look back to see, am I hurt? What should I do? Do you think that I'm hurt? And it's a mind meld going on, that distance contact. And that just keeps getting more and more sophisticated as kids get up into their latency age, the school age, preteen, teen, and so on, and continues lifelong, as this kind of connection that we need. And it's sometimes it involves a cell phone and texting, and sometimes it involves Facebook and all sorts of things. But to get back to your question about how does this neediness then impact families and parents in particular? Well, I think it's exhausting. Foster mother came in and I said, well, this was our first meeting. I said, well, tell me a little bit about, I'll use the name Billy. She said, well, he's hard, he's difficult for me. He's exhausting. I said, well, what is it that bothers you? She said, well, that's just it. It's not one thing. It's like everything. She said, when he enters the family room after supper, we're all gathering around for family time. And it's like a giant syringe has entered the room and sucked all the energy out of the room. It's sort of like robbing the oxygen, taking all the oxygen from the room, because his needs have to be first and foremost without interruption. It's exhausting for parents, I think. Charlie, I don't know if you've seen that. I'm sure you have, with parents where they come in and it's just they feel drained.
Absolutely. And many times with the foster families that I worked with, where this was a dynamic that the child brought to the family, excuse me, the exhaustion is also coupled with guilt, meaning that the parent initially thought, oh, this child needs me, which they do. But what they didn't understand was the need was infinite. And so the parent becomes exhausted, and what started out as, oh, I want to respond to the child's needs. This is I can tell that they need my attention. They need me to be physically present. And when it gets exhausting, then impatience can sit in. And when impatience sits in with all of us, we might become frustrated. And then after frustration, the parent feels guilty about becoming frustrated. So it starts to get complex at that point, that what starts as exhaustion, or excuse me, which starts as I know that the child needs me and I want to be responsive, can lead to exhaustion, can lead to impatience. And impatience at times based on response can cause guilt. And I think another dynamic in this is that, if we had, as a part of our podcast, all had an infant with us, and the infant started to fuss, we'd all be very patient with that. We look at the infant and said, oh, they must be hungry, or I'll check to make sure they're warm, or we'd look on how we could guarantee safety. It's easy to be patient with an infant that's signaling their neediness to us, but it can get exhausting, and we can become quickly exhausted when that is in the form of a 10-year-old. There's a difference in our patience level eventually when it comes to us, for lack of a better way to say it, in a bigger form.
Yeah, what he said, I have to agree. I mean, that's a wonderful way of formulating that, Charlie. And it's interesting that if we all had this hypothetical little infant with us right now, the size of the infant physically matches the size of the needs that are expressed.
Correct.
And it's that mismatch between chronological age, size, and let's call it developmental arrest, for lack of a better term, that the child is emotionally stunted and maybe held back in their development to the point where it seems inappropriate. It's just discombobulating for the family. And like you said, can cause some, not only exhaustion, but guilt feelings that follow. You had mentioned earlier, Charlie, this was, you're saying that children can go to extremes to sort of get responses from folks, I think you were getting at. And I think, Bridget, you were talking about that as well, a child maybe having to knock on you, literally, in a desperate attempt, a tragic expression of an unmet need. There's different forms that this takes, I think, in terms of children's increasingly desperate attempts to adapt to a world in which they were neglected early. This is what everyone inherits later. is the skill set that they've developed in a world that was not responding to that little baby even. You know, when a baby, a cute little baby, you know, this blank screen, well, it's not really a blank screen, but this little child that we can pour so much into and respond to, that wasn't done early on. And so children learn early to adapt by different ways. One is to be completely compliant. Correct. And not make not stir things up, to blend into the woodwork. That's one way in which some of them reverse their roles and they wonder, how are you doing, mommy? How are you doing, daddy? And they start taking care of other siblings. And so their needs are directed and deflected onto other children. And maybe they get some kudos for that. So they reverse roles. Sometimes they just withdraw and give up. I mean, playing that game of serve and return, where the tennis ball never comes back, the signal is never answered, to use Charlie's term, the child gets discouraged, despairs, and just walks away from the whole thing, or goes off sometimes with strangers, seeks the friendly stranger out to meet the needs in public places, and makes themselves very vulnerable. Anyway, though, I was thinking, I just wanted to mention that there's different ways in which kids, and I would say the most extreme and exhausting is when the child is the scapegoated child, where they've decided bad behavior, naughty behavior gets me some modicum of attention. At least I'm not invisible.
Mm-hmm. You know, that's a great segue into a concern that I've heard expressed by foster parents kind of in retrospect, which is that I feel guilty about neglecting other relationships in my family because the child's need is so extreme that they take what used to be some of the attention that I needed to give to other children in our family, my spouse. An interesting piece of that is that I had the opportunity, this is a number of years ago though, to do a focus group with kids and adults whose parents had done foster care and currently were doing foster care, which led to a panel that we did as a foster parent training. And for the panel, we had one youth that was in middle school, his parents were still doing foster care. One high school student whose parents were still doing foster care, a young adult who was in college, whose parents were still doing foster care, and then a person in their mid-30s whose parents had done foster care where they were growing up. And they talked about this issue and they felt it. And they didn't know how to articulate that to the parents at the time. And when they said they felt it most intensely, was the initial phase of placement. That when the child first came into the home, it seemed like all foster parent attention was on that child. And as we know, that's the busiest part of placement: school, possible connection with therapists, health needs, hopefully safely having the child settle into the home. But what was absent then was a recognition on how that was affecting other children and family members. So they all said that that was tough on them until they were able to figure that out with their parents. And the other thing that they talked about was how the child sometimes, and this hits Rick's point, how the child sometimes would treat their parents, which would not be tolerated by them treating their parent that way. And so that would cause conflict. And again, that all kind of was wrapped up in a ball that was placed in the foster parent's lap, which was, you are neglecting me. And so that's an important dynamic to remember. And so many times, if we're just aware of those risk factors, we can talk openly about our own children, our spouse about those things, so that we can come up with solutions. So I wanted to add that in the mix too, of how does this neediness affect foster parents?
Well, and I think, when you're talking about the kind of a comparison a little bit between a baby and the needs and a 10-year-old and needs, I think another thing we might maybe mistake in that is, those babies, I picture it's almost like kind of the village comes around and helps.
Mhm.
Other people are like, oh, I'll take the baby. Oh, you must be a little tired. Babies are a lot of work. Oh, how are you dealing with it? People bring food or offered us support. And yet, I think foster parents of a 10-year-old or even parents of older kids can sometimes think, well, this is on me now. Like I shouldn't need all the support, or the help that I needed when this little guy or girl was a baby. So I think that's an important parallel too that we could maybe even offer to foster parents a little bit. Like, let's just really think about what this child would have needed as a baby and what you would have needed as a baby in terms of your support system, and
Mhm.
whether that's
Yes.
emotional or physical or just procuring goods or whatever it is.
No,
Yeah, I think
that's very well said. We don't do baby showers for 10-year-olds.
Correct.
We,
Right.
we,
Good point.
maybe
Yes.
we should.
Yes.
yeah, but we should possibly,
We should,
definitely.
We
yes.
should possibly. Yes.
Well, I
Yes.
was thinking the other thing too is that foster parents in support groups, foster parents who have access to respite care, may be able to get breathers in some way from a child with that sort of incessant. It seems bottomless. Charlie used the word infinite, and it seems so discouraging, frightening, and almost unworkable that it does seem infinite. Everything I do, I pour in, pour in, pour in, and it never fills up. And I think that we need to shore families up to say it can be filled. The child can be filled. That they've never really had a partner in meeting their needs before. They had someone maybe who was dismissive or rejecting, preoccupied with substance use disorder, domestic violence. I think you've mentioned that, Charlie, too. Any kind of maltreatment can take away from a caregiver or caregivers. So, yeah, my thought is that it is this sort of state that the child is left in and the parent is left in. Will I ever be enough for this child?
Mhm.
And talking with others who have similar experiences with children can eliminate the tendency that we might have is that this child feels entitled. This child feels is spoiled and feels that they're the center of the universe, that they're a little narcissist. Well, those terms might kind of fit, those adjectives to an extent, but if we know narcissism and so on, it really comes from a sense of void, low self-esteem, insecurity, and so on, and it masks that. So we need people who know that it's beyond that. I'm exhausted. This child's needs are real, but so are mine, and so are the rest of the families.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that if we kind of put it into a real succinct way of looking at what causes this neediness in kids, this is how I would look at it, is that there was a term that I can't claim as my own, but it was called fear without solution, meaning that so many foster youth that I had the opportunity to work with taught me that they were scared kids, that because of the neglect that they'd experienced and very unfortunate traumatic experiences that they had, that they never had the opportunity to trust an adult that could protect them. So they lived in a constant state of fear and hypervigilance. And for the children that we're talking about, their way of coping with that was on a consistent basis to be constantly checking if they were safe. And that can be replicated through many of the things we talked about already in the podcast, that I need to ask all the time and judge if that parent still likes me and if I'm still secure here. And there's reasons they have this need, and it can be exhausting, but it is then up to us to really kind of come up with ways on how we can meet that need and hopefully help them heal from that past neglect and trauma and a combination of those, so that foster parents can care for them in a way that's not exhausting, and that the child can eventually begin to trust that adults do care about them. So I think that is our challenge.
I think so too, Charlie. And I was just thinking that the reminder constantly that this is a larger child with the needs of a infant or a toddler.
Right.
And just to keep that as a mantra. You know, speaking of the fears beneath the need, the fears if I'm being watched, being protected, just being attended to and seen. I went to a foster family to their home, used to see a lot of families right in their home. And I saw this little child running around with, and he was 4. And so it was summertime, and you know what kids look like, their legs look like in the summer in Minnesota or maybe anywhere there. If they wear shorts and so on, you see all the bruises of different, many colors. You know, they're green and brown and purple and gray, but they run into so much stuff. You know, they're out there hopefully playing, and you get fewer abuses if you're on the internet all the time, though. So that's one thing for having our kids connected to Wi-Fi at all times. No, I'm just being facetious there, but the children running around like that, and I looked at him and I thought, boy, he's really been severely injured here, hasn't he? He had bandages and band-aids and more bandages and the little cute little animal bandages and SpongeBob SquarePants bandages and Disney bandages. I mean, it was everything imaginable, all up and down the legs. And I was saying, did he go into a briar patch or something? Did the chiggers get him? Or I mean, what happened? She says, oh, I've noticed that, you know, he's little, and he used to say, I got this owie, and it was so tiny that it was microscopic. I couldn't see it ever. And so, but he seemed to need that. So I used that as a way of connecting. So I'd slap a Band-Aid on there and kiss it and make it better. And pretty soon he's starting to look like wallpaper walking down the street. But she said, this is how I thought I could meet needs that are obviously littler inside. You know, you have a littler child inside. The other thing, so that fear of getting invisible, she worked with him on that. And now he's an adult, wears a 3-piece suit, and those bandages all over his pant legs are unsightly, but meeting a need. I'm kidding on that, of course. But yeah, I think that these types of things with the children needing to know that we are there for them and that they're not invisible.
Absolutely. And I think, Rick, a core piece that you talk nicely about is that is really trying to form a partnership with the child in helping the child understand that they are secure in that setting and safe. And if I can, I'd like to kind of share on the podcast an example I've got of a youth that was incredibly needy and had night terrors in the evening, and how that foster parent with some assistance responded to that child's need. And that child, at the time of that this was occurring, although it had been long-term, was in foster care, but then it had evolved into a pre-adoption placement with this foster parent. And for the sake of confidentiality, we'll refer to the foster parent as Sally, and we'll refer to the young man as Pete. And the dog, I don't know if dogs are covered by confidentiality rules, but if they are,
you have to be HIPAA compliant.
Okay, we'll refer to the dog as Fido. And I have permission from the adoptive mom, who's now the adoptive mom, to share this. This is her written description of how night times went. And they would peak during the process of adoption, when the young man started to understand that he was not returning home to his own parents. But what she wrote is that there's almost always a need for physical reassurance, hugs, cuddles, talking. He displays mixed feelings. He'll say to me, I love you. I'm going to live here forever. I hate you. I'm going to a different home. Fido is going to die, and you won't have a dog anymore. He bites his nails. He wets every night. He says, I'm scared of everything, especially the dark and the scary big men. And those nightmares are almost every night. He sits in bed and screams. He prefers sleeping in a sleeping bag next to my bed or under the bed with Fido. He makes noises when he's very stressed and worried, such as monkey noises, yells, or pretends to be somebody else. So the night, and you can imagine what happens when you've got a child that's doing this. Child is exhausted, soon to be adopted mother is exhausted as well. And so what we asked him to do was to draw a picture of the big scary man, which he refused to do, but he allowed me to draw it on his behalf. And it was indeed a big, red, scary man that looked very dangerous. And then we talked a lot about the things in life that made him feel safe. And we got a good collection of those things. And that was it was a great session being able to do that. This was an incredible foster adopt mother. She was incredibly skilled in multiple ways, but she was skilled also in an artistic way. So she and I then wrote a story that then she put into a book, which became his nighttime bedtime story. And I'm going to read that to you. And again, his real name is not Pete. The dog's real name is not Fido. And the foster adopt's name is not Sally. Those have all been changed. Here's the story. Once upon a time, there was a 5-year-old boy named Pete. Pete is a nice little boy with handsome blue eyes and a bright smile. Pete has many, many people who love and care about him. Many of the people who love Pete are big, strong people who would never hurt Pete and would also not let other people hurt Pete. Not only do so many people love and protect Pete, but Fido the dog is a close friend of Pete's who is often by Pete's side, plays with Pete, and protects Pete. Sometimes at night, when Pete is sleeping, he has a very scary dream. The scary dream is about Pete and his friends playing at a playground. In the dream, a big scary man with a red face tries to take Pete and tries to hurt him. But Pete and his friends are always able to fight the big man off. And his friends always win. There is also a big sign on Pete's door which now says, "No big scary men with red faces allowed," by order of Fido the dog. And Fido has signed that sign with a paw print. Even though Pete knows that Fido and all the big people that love Pete would never, ever let anyone hurt him, he still sometimes has that scary dream at night. But Pete has learned that if he takes some of the things that make him feel safe at night and puts them by his bed, he doesn't have the dreams very often. So every night, Pete has Fido lay down next to his bed. Also, Pete has a t-shirt from his Sally mom that he uses as a pillowcase so that he always feels safe and close to Sally mom when he's sleeping. Pete also puts his special big cat stuffed animal around his bed because that also makes him feel safe. He also leaves his bedroom lights on because that helps him feel safe. So now when Pete goes to bed, he gets a big hug from Sally mom after they read this story together. Then he curls up in his special blanket with his favorite music on. But before he goes to sleep, he remembers all the people and Fido that love him and will keep him safe every day and every night. So
That's a sweet story.
That is so sweet.
So what that amplifies is that it broke down all of his fears, which was that nobody will protect him. And with the foster adopt mom's assistance, we were able to exaggerate in a healthy way everything that will protect him and that he can bank on, rather than going back to what we discussed earlier of how all adult relationships are viewed through the lens of, can I trust, will they hang with me? This reinforces that they will, including Fido, who was a big dog and actually did sign that sign with a paw print. And that was a repetitive story that he meant. So it hit the needs that he had not had met in the first 6 years of his life. So anyway, the reason I share that is because I think it illustrates everything we've talked about how needs that are neglected becomes needs that can be constant, but there is some reparative work that we can do to help kids heal, but we got to break it down and
Charlie,
really exaggerate them for
I
kids.
wanted to mention something too about that it's wonderful bringing up the story about safety and feeling safe in the context of a loving family with a dog and all of that, just being surrounded and enveloped in safety. And there's some kids, I think, out there who feel that they have to provide their own safety.
Exactly.
And so maybe they sleep with a knife under their pillow, which freaks parents out. Maybe they have different rituals that they have that I think foster parents can join in and make as a cooperative venture to make sure that you're safe. And I think your story does that so well. I think that's you're not alone in providing safety, and people aren't turning a deaf ear to your needs. They're listening, they're attuned to that.
Just like the infant that cries because they're hungry or scared has an adult respond, but it might not be the same adult every time. But the importance is that it's a response and it's consistent and it's there all the time. And so there are ways that we can work with kids that haven't had that, to exaggerate that in a positive way so that they can eventually, hopefully, trust that can be their reality with adults as well.
That's right. And I think the old school thought about that was that eventually you internalize in your psyche a picture of caregivers around you that are responsive, that are available, reliable, and sensitive. You internalize that into yourself and it becomes rote. It's a memory now that you can count on as you toddle off to preschool, that at the end of the day, you'll be greeted by your caregiver. As you close your eyes at night, which is an extreme, I would say, act of trust on the part of a child, that you close your eyes and let yourself fall off to sleep, knowing you're enveloped in safety. So, yeah, it's, I was going to say that in addition to working with foster children while they're living in the foster families or being adopted by foster families, I also worked in residential treatment centers where kids had gotten so out of control in extreme ways that no one could take them, apparently. And so they were put in residential treatment centers to get them ready to go back into family living. And one child had to have line of sight with an adult at all times, and if couldn't do that, was not able to function very well. She couldn't go to the restroom by herself without asking for the female staff to go with her. This a little, probably 8-year-old. And so the staff said, well, we can't really do that. There's privacy rules and so on. But then she would smear on the walls in there as a way of sort of paying them back for not being there when she needed them most. So they ended up using a kite string that tied to her finger, went under the bathroom door and onto their finger in the hallway, where they sat patiently while she went to the restroom. But it was like an umbilical cord.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I love hearing all of these little tips that I mean, they're so simple once you hear them, but you just don't
That's
think about them. So I love all that you're sharing.
Yeah, and
And
to
I
tell
just,
you the truth,
yeah.
like Charlie was saying, he couldn't claim, that term he used earlier, that, and a lot of these strategies that we might mention, or things to consider, and anecdotes of things families come up with, a lot of that is just the genius of foster parents who've had to
Right.
cope with things that are so unusual, not expecting what they're getting when the child arrives, and it shows a lot of these mysterious behaviors. So we have to hand it to our foster parents and caseworkers and therapists, who all have to think outside the bun, as they say at Taco Bell, and come up with solutions.
Yeah, I just want to take maybe one extra minute and just reinforce the power of that story that you shared, Charlie, because I think there's so many lessons for foster parents in that. I guess ones that I maybe grabbed that were good reminders for me, that kids like a good story,
They do.
especially if they're a character in that story.
Yeah.
And you're almost, you get to tap into that imagination with them.
Hmm.
You get to collaborate with them.
Hmm.
I just love this process of almost creating together.
Hmm.
And then another huge benefit is you have this ritual now. You've
Hmm.
set up this ritual that every night we get to do this
Hmm.
and come back to it, which just reinforces that safety and the trust. It just, the warmth that came from just hearing it, it was just such a reminder that, whether we're 1 or 3 or 10, or the big kids reading Harry Potter, like there's just so much power in story. But then
Exactly.
you add that layer of story with another person, and you add that layer of creating the story and using imagination. And then
Mhm.
you add the layer of like a ritual being
Mhm.
established between this caregiver and the child. It's just so powerful. So I just want to reinforce for if our
Yeah.
listeners and foster parents are thinking, oh, that was a good idea. Like you could do that too in many different forms, even if it's,
Yeah.
a 2-minute thing that they create every night about, you know, who's here and the protecting and the process of the day and whatever it is. So thank you for
Real
that. I
genius.
appreciate that.
It's real genius, yeah, and it's tender too.
Tender,
The
yeah.
idea of a narrative that speaks directly to that child's life.
Mhm.
It's a custom built bedtime story, which is so neat
Mhm.
to take
Well,
the
right, and
time.
is rewriting the story that's up there to your
There's
point, Rick.
rewriting
Like
it.
the story up there is bedtime is scary, nobody cares about me, somebody's gonna hurt me. And that story just every night rewrites the
Yes.
narrative that I'm safe, that I'm protected, people love me, they'll be here for me tomorrow. Yeah.
And even
It's
Yeah.
one
the pillow with the t-shirt. I mean, the little things
Yes,
too, the
even that.
tangible, like,
Yes.
yeah.
it's one thing to say to a child, you can trust me, you're safe here, which I think has a very short life expectancy.
Yeah.
Um, but it's another thing to, in a moment of calm at bedtime, to hear something that the child has been part of and creating, and that's all real for the child, the stuffed animal, Fido, all the people that care about you, and to hear that routinely, it's almost like in a way we're convincing the child of what that we want them to feel safe and cared about.
There's a couple things that I was thinking that safe and cared for. And the cared for part is what I wanted to emphasize a little bit here is like I remember working with a little boy who was he was very docile, and whenever I'd see him in the foster family, he moved to a residential facility for a while. Even there, he was like this. He was like a wallflower child on the perimeter of every room, kind of blending in with surroundings, never interacting with anybody, but always you could see that his eyes were on what was going on and the attention that other kids were getting from caregivers, from staff members in the residential facility. So you could see almost that he was envying that, but didn't know how to go about asking for that. Extremely needy but unable to get the need met until he would periodically blow sky high and do something dangerous or do something where you could not ignore the behavior. He was rattling our cages. And, it took him that kind of extreme measure. What I think it took eventually is to realize his story, his narrative was that he was a child that was pretty much unplanned, maybe unwanted, maybe that might be extreme, certainly not the most preferred family member of his group of siblings. And when he was to appear for family therapy one day, the family showed up with all their other kids except him, who they inadvertently left out in the car. And there was kind of a head to the face, forehead, oops, like we forgot him. And he was like an oversight. He was an invisible child, and he had to get to and so he treated everybody else with this peripheral relationship until he couldn't stand the envy of attention any longer. So there's ways of dealing with that, and there's one way that I think we'll be talking about here in a little bit for takeaways and next steps foster parents could consider is to spend one-on-one time, quality time with a child like that. You can do it in groups, you can do quality time, but in some ways, with some children, it can count against you when you get together as a family because they're more focused on what they're not getting.
Correct.
And seeing other kids getting the attention, they think that maybe they should have all the attention. So it's a deficit mentality all the time for them. But one-on-one, easier said than done, though, if you've got 5 foster kids. Oh, just spend 10 minutes with them every day. Oh, yeah, right. And do that twice a day, maybe. Do the math, and you got 2 hours worth of one-on-one audiences with the kids. So one of the ways to do this is to equip the child with the ways in which he can alter his own perception of himself. He is now a potent actor in getting people to take care of his needs with him. He reaches out. And what you would do is if you saw the child on the perimeter being a good child, but very docile and too compliant, is you'd invite that child. Isn't there some attention you might want? And you coach them, almost like a coach on the sidelines at a football game, calling in plays. Doing that allows the child to have a life skill of getting their needs met, and it reshapes their narrative about us, whether we're stingy and unfair or fair in how we give attention, and whether they have the power to get their needs met within a relationship. So coaching is a big deal, observing the kids and really making a study of them, and then coaching them with the words. Use your words to be able to impact caregivers.
Rick, the way you presented that tweaked in my mind something too, which is if a child in foster care in your home displays this level of neediness, and you are starting to feel impatient, and you can see that it's taxing on your family, I think it's really wise in these types of situations to seek out a therapist to work with you and the child, and possibly other family members based on the case situations, because we're always better with somebody that can add to ideas in how we can be helpful. And my suggestion to foster parents is always, pick your therapist wisely. Pick a therapist that is trauma informed and also has experience working with foster families, because the dynamics are different than families that are intact. But indeed, then I think it's easier to come up with some interventions that are doable, that amplify all the things we've talked about here, as far as illustrating to the child that they're safe in your setting and that they can begin to trust that. And I think a therapist can be really helpful in that capacity.
That's a good reminder, Charlie. Yeah, and I think that always, just to add to that letting the caseworker know, maybe it's you have a caseworker, maybe the child has a separate caseworker, let them know that this is an issue. It may be hard to define sometimes because it doesn't always resort in bad behavior that's extreme,
Right.
acting out, but notifying them so that they know that you probably need some time so that you don't burn out.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's just things you can't think of alone. You know, you mentioned that bathroom situation in residential. I remember this was a foster youth in the home that was refusing showers. And the foster parents worked with breaking that down to the point where we determined that he was very sensitive to being touched by things. And we do believe, and he eventually, if I remember correctly, eventually did disclose that he'd been sexually traumatized. But we had him select then what he felt comfortable being washed with. When he washed himself, it was gel soap, sponges. And his request was that the foster dad sit outside the shower room and sing songs so that he always knew that the foster dad was available. Now, tell me what that says. What that says is, as when I, as a child, feel the most vulnerable, where I've been hurt previously, I need to know that I'm safe.
Yeah.
I need
He's
to know.
developing a new soundtrack as
Exactly.
well.
Yes.
You know, I
Soundtrack for the
think that,
home.
again, like that narrative rewrite that Bridget
Yeah.
was talking about. And Chris, were you going to make a comment too?
Oh, I was just saying, like, creating a soundtrack for your home. We just had a webinar training on that.
Did you?
Could fit nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, well, what the soundtrack that is going on in the child's brain, I think, can be a little cacophonous. You know, it's a little bit noisy in there, I think, at times, and confusing. A nephew lived with us for a while when he was 16, and his mom was having a hard time getting him to do anything, and it was pretty volatile. So he lived in the basement for a while. Every morning he woke himself up to get to school with two different clock radios, one that played rap and one that played heavy metal from the left and the right. That would wake him up, and everybody else in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
But
Too many
when
blocks.
I think of that, I think of sometimes the kids have that same sort of soundtrack going on, which is so, you know, it's hard. It's a din. And what the sound, the lyrics of the soundtrack go like this, I think. No one meets my needs freely. No one anticipates my needs before I even get them expressed myself. And I must sneak to get my needs met, or I must rattle people's cages to just pay attention. Those kind of thoughts, if we can kind of assume that something akin to that is going on in the child's mind, we can, when we sit down with them, and I was thinking, going forward with kids, one of the steps to consider is to have the talk about, you know, that you have a lot of needs, and there's no blame for that. You have a lot of reason for having these great needs, and we want to help you meet them. So we validate that, and then we can kind of go from there about the particulars. Charlie, you know, some of the rituals you've brought up, and we can talk the details then. But I think this whole idea of, it's your right to have needs. We want you to tell us what those needs, feelings, and even what your wants are.
Yeah.
Well, Rick and Charlie, we've had another episode with great advice, suggestions. Your case examples are wonderful for our audience. Makes them feel like they're heard and like, hey, this is happening elsewhere. So thanks for joining us again today. And I don't know if you have any last words that you didn't get in this episode. You can share them now.
The only thing I say, I know I say it repeatedly, is I just so appreciate foster parents doing what they do. And in my head, it's a case of simple math. You have the most potential to help a child heal because you are with the child 24/7. And we appreciate all that you do.
Yeah, and Charlie, second that emotion. And my thought would be that also you and I, all of us here in this discussion, have been students at the knees of many foster parents. You know,
Correct.
as foster parents learn from their kids by keenly observing what's seen and unseen, we've been students of many foster parents and caseworkers, therapists who've been doing this for years and are such veterans and come up with such creative and loving interventions,
Mhm.
I know.
including
I feel
bedtime
grateful for all the
stories.
learning that they've
Mhm.
given me over the years.
Yeah, isn't
Right.
it? Yeah.
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 And it's
something.
Foster Care Appreciation Month, so we're recording this in May, and just a shout out to the foster community. Thanks for all you do. And hey, Charlie and Rick will be back for a couple more episodes, so make sure to tune in when those hit the podcast universe.